Okay, so you want to own a fighter jet. Not a replica hanging in a garage, not a video game, a real one. You buy it, you get checked out in it, and it lives in a hangar with your name on the paperwork. You taxi it out yourself on a quiet weekday morning, light the afterburner over open desert, and pull a turn that a commercial pilot will never once feel in an entire career. No wingman radioing orders, no mission brief, no one telling you when the flight ends. Just you, a machine built to fight nations, and a stretch of open sky you're allowed to use however you want. That's the picture. That's what the listing photos and the airshow videos sell, and it's what almost every person who's ever watched a jet scream overhead has quietly wondered about. It isn't that simple. Almost everything in that picture is more complicated, more regulated, and more expensive than it looks from the ground. So let's start with what you think you're buying. You think you're buying an airplane. What you're actually buying is a legal, financial, and mechanical obligation that happens to be shaped like a fighter jet. And here's the part that surprises most people. None of this is a thought experiment dreamed up for a video. People have actually done it, start to finish. So let's walk through it exactly the way you'd have to. What you're allowed to buy, what it costs, what you'd need to study, and what you could actually do with it once it's yours. Your first move isn't a phone call to a jet broker. It's a harder question aimed at yourself. What am I even legally allowed to own? You cannot buy an F-16 flying real missions today, or an F-35 or an F-22 at any price. Active duty combat jets simply are not for sale to civilians. The only fighter jets you could ever put your name on are aircraft their home country has already retired from frontline service. Even then, that government has to approve the export, and the FAA has to approve the import before a single piece of paperwork can move in your favor. So the real question was never what do you want to fly? It's what has some government already decided it no longer needs? That same basic rule quietly governs almost every kind of military hardware you could ever imagine owning, from attack helicopters to Cold War-era bombers. Retired only, never active duty. A fighter jet is simply the fastest, loudest version of a rule that shows up again and again the moment you start pricing out anything built to fight a war. Assuming you clear that bar, you don't shop for a fighter jet the way you'd shop for a car. There's no dealership, no showroom, no test drive. You'd start with a small handful of specialist brokers, firms like Code One Aviation or Raptor Aviation, who deal almost exclusively in retired Cold War-era jets. Nearly everything they sell traces back to the same moment. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, countries like Ukraine, Bulgaria, and the former Yugoslav republics were stuck with fleets they could no longer afford to fly. Through the 1990s, those governments liquidated hundreds of jets through licensed brokers and military auctions, and that same surplus pipeline is still, decades later, where nearly every civilian-owned fighter jet in the world traces back to. Scroll through a real listing today, and the same names come up again and again. L-39 Albatross, MiG-21, MiG-29, F-5, A-4 Skyhawk. Different countries, one leftover Cold War. It feels less like buying a vehicle, and more like being handed a small, strange inheritance nobody else wanted. And a broker doesn't work for free. Commissions on aircraft sales typically run 1 to 10% of the price, with around 5% a common benchmark, though multi-million-dollar jets often settle closer to 1 to 3%. Before any money changes hands, you'd commission a pre-purchase inspection. An independent mechanic tears into logbooks, borescopes the engine, and checks that the airframe's history actually matches what the seller is telling you. That inspection alone can take days, and it exists for one reason. In this market, a jet with a gap in its paperwork is worth dramatically less than one with a clean, verifiable history. Financing complicates things further. Few banks will lend against a demilitarized ex-Soviet fighter jet as collateral, so most buyers at this level are paying cash, not making payments. That single fact quietly filters out almost everyone who might otherwise want in on this hobby, long before demilitarization or training ever enter the picture. By the time you've paid the broker, the inspector, and the seller, you've spent real money before the jet has ever left the ground under your ownership. Before you even get to the sticker price, there's a piece of paperwork strategy nearly every new buyer tries, and it mostly doesn't work. Delaware and Oregon charge no sales tax on aircraft purchases, so the obvious move looks like buying through a Delaware LLC and pocketing the difference. It's a myth. What actually determines your tax bill isn't where your LLC is incorporated, it's where the aircraft is physically based and operated. Fly it home to a state with a use tax, and that state can, and does, come looking for its share, regardless of what's printed on the registration. Tax authorities in several states are now specifically trained to spot a Delaware shell company on an aircraft title. It doesn't hide the transaction, it flags it. So the paperwork trick that sounds clever in theory quietly becomes one more line item real owners budget for instead of avoiding. Here's where your own budget starts making the decision for you, and it turns out there isn't just one tier, there are three. At the entry level, a flyable Aero L39 Albatross runs $200,000 to $500,000, a real number a successful small business owner could actually reach. One rung up, a MiG-21, the Soviet Union's signature Cold War interceptor, starts at around $70,000 in rough flying condition and runs $300,000 to $800,000 for a genuinely airworthy example. It's a strange quirk of this market. A supersonic-capable jet that once defended Soviet airspace can cost less than a trainer built to teach cadets. At the very top, a MiG-29, an actual Mach 2 interceptor, runs closer to $4.65 million for a comparable example on the market. And that's before you've spent $1 on demilitarization, paperwork, training, or a single hour of actually flying any of them. Ownership at this level splits into roughly three groups: individual collectors buying for the thrill of it, companies like Draken International buying entire fleets to run as a business, and museums or nonprofits preserving history rather than flying it hard. Most first-time owners stop at the L39 or the MiG-21, and for good reason. Together, they're the aircraft that actually built this entire hobby. Whatever you choose, it doesn't arrive combat ready. Before it ever reaches your hangar, it has to be demilitarized, no exceptions. Every gun and cannon gets physically removed. Every targeting radar gets stripped out. Every electronic jamming system gets disabled. The hard points where missiles and bombs once hung get welded shut permanently, a process an inspector has to verify by hand before you ever take delivery. If your jet is coming from overseas, you'd add a second gauntlet on top: State Department export licensing under ITAR, the same law that governs weapons exports. That review alone can take months, and it can still come back with a no. And that license isn't just a one-time stamp. Export-controlled paperwork like this can come with compliance obligations attached to the aircraft for as long as you own it, not just at the moment of sale. And here's the part nobody tells you going in: even a fully demilitarized jet with clean paperwork isn't permanently safe. In 2007, federal agents seized 4 F-14 Tomcats from owners who believed, on paper, they'd already done everything right. 3 were museum pieces. 1 had been a TV prop. Regulators decided, years later, that the demilitarization on file wasn't good enough after all. So understand this before you sign anything. Owning a fighter jet is never fully, permanently settled. It's yours until someone decides it isn't. Owning it doesn't mean you're cleared to fly it. The FAA still requires a type-specific checkout before anyone lets you go up solo. Because a jet like the L-39 isn't FAA type certified for civilian flight training, that checkout only happens through a small handful of specialist schools. Code 1 Aviation, the Jet Warbird Training Center in Santa Fe, and Up and Ready Flight all run the same kind of program, an intensive 2 to 3 day course. Most of these programs expect you to arrive already an experienced pilot. This isn't where you learn to fly. It's where an experienced pilot learns to fly something this fast for the first time. In that short window, you'd cram in ground school, simulator time where it's available, and a check ride before anyone hands you the keys to fly it alone. If your jet has a working ejection seat, add egress and parachute training on top, learning to actually survive the one system you hope you'll never need. And qualifying once isn't the end of it. Insurers and the FAA both expect recurrent training and regular time and type to keep you legal and insurable year after year. None of these schools publish a price online. In this hobby, even finding out what your own training costs means picking up a phone and asking a stranger directly. It's a strange kind of exam. Pass, and you're one of a few hundred people on Earth qualified to fly a Soviet-designed jet trainer. Fail, and the jet just sits there, very expensive and very silent. There's one more bill before you've even started the engine. Somewhere to put it. A private jet hangar typically rents for $1,500 to $3,000 a month, though that's for a business jet, not a jet built for a military ramp. Push into a larger space the kind of fighter jet with a wide wingspan actually needs, and prime location hangars run $4,000 to $7,000 a month. Add fire suppression, security, and climate control for delicate Cold War-era Soviet avionics, and most owners end up budgeting $30,000 to $100,000 a year just for a place to park it. That's an entire second mortgage's worth of money, spent every year, before the jet has burned a single gallon of fuel. Say you're qualified now, insured, hangared, standing on the ramp next to a jet that's actually yours. Here's what every single hour in the air costs you from this point on. An L-39 burns roughly 160 gallons of fuel an hour at cruise. At today's Jet A price, around $7.76 a gallon, that's about $1.240 an hour just in fuel. Push it into a hard climb and burn jumps to 330 gallons an hour, more than doubling your fuel bill for those few minutes alone. Owners commonly report all-in costs of $1, $200 to $2,000 a flight hour once fuel, routine maintenance, and insurance reserves are counted together. Fuel alone can eat almost the entire number. Then there's insurance. A high-value turbine or jet aircraft commonly runs $25,000 a year or more, and only a handful of underwriters on Earth will even write a policy on an aircraft with a working ejection seat in it. That figure typically only covers the aircraft itself. Liability coverage, for the version of this story where something goes wrong over a populated area, is its own separate and separately expensive policy. And every 1,000 flight hours, the single turbofan engine needs a full overhaul, a bill around $150,000 on its own. Fly it casually, and that bill finds you again roughly once a decade. Fly it hard, and it comes back a lot sooner. Spare parts add their own tax on your patience. With no factory supply chain left, a broken part can mean weeks or months grounded, waiting on salvage from another airframe half a world away. Even the paperwork has a price. Annual airworthiness inspections and avionics recertification are recurring costs of their own, quiet, unglamorous, and due every single year, regardless of how much you actually flew. Add it up, and the purchase price you budgeted for on day one turns out to be the smallest number on the entire spreadsheet. At this point, a reasonable person starts asking, does anyone actually pay all of this alone? Often, no. Warbird syndicates let several owners share one jet, splitting the purchase price, the hangar, the insurance, and the maintenance reserve across a small group of partners. It's the same logic as fractional ownership in the private jet world, just applied to a machine that costs even more to keep flying. Everyone gets fewer hours in the seat than a sole owner would, but everyone also writes a dramatically smaller check to stay in the hobby at all. For a lot of owners, this is the actual entry point. Not a single name on the registration, but a handful of names sharing one very expensive hobby. It's the same math that built the modern private jet charter industry, just applied to a machine most charter companies would never dream of putting on their certificate. So it's paid for, insured, hangared, and you're qualified to fly it. What does a person actually do with a fighter jet once it's sitting in their own hangar? The obvious answer: air shows. There's a real warbird jet community built around organizations like the Classic Jet Aircraft Association, running a circuit of fly-ins, formation flying clinics, and air show appearances most owners eventually join. Formation flying in particular has its own culture. Trained civilian jet teams fly tight. Disciplined routines that took months of dedicated clinics to earn the right to perform. A less obvious answer: it can become an investment instead of just an expense. Dealers in this market report that well-documented, well-restored warbirds have historically held, or even gained, value, driven by rarity and verified history, not speculation. That's the opposite of almost every other vehicle on Earth. The most ambitious answer of all: you could turn it into an actual business. And that's not a hypothetical either. Somebody already did exactly that, starting from the exact same first jet this whole video just walked you through buying. And eventually, most owners face the same question in reverse: how do you get out? Selling isn't like listing a car. The buyer pool for a demilitarized fighter jet is measured in dozens of people worldwide, not thousands. It goes back through the same small circle of specialist brokers you bought it from, and it can take months to find a buyer who's not just wealthy, but willing to clear every regulatory step you once cleared yourself. Owners who've done the math treat that illiquidity as its own cost. The money isn't gone, but it isn't especially close to your hands either, for as long as you own the jet. Which is exactly why the syndicate model keeps growing. Shared ownership doesn't just split the bills, it splits the risk of being stuck holding an asset almost no one can quickly buy from you. Every owner in this hobby eventually learns the same lesson. Getting in is a negotiation. Getting back out is a search. In 2011, a young entrepreneur named Jared Isaacman looked at this exact hobby and asked one bigger question: what if you didn't stop at owning just one jet? He founded Draken International, buying up retired fighter jets other countries no longer wanted, and built it into the largest private fleet of tactical military aircraft on Earth, over 80 jets today. Mirage F1s from Spain, A4 Skyhawks, Czech-built L159s, ex-South African Atlas Cheetahs, a deep stockpile of MiG-21s, the same jet sitting at the entry tier of this very ladder. Every single one of them started the exact same way your hypothetical jet just did: retired, demilitarized, and legally acquired. In 2018, the US Air Force paid Draken $280 million to fly those very jets as the enemy, training American pilots against realistic Cold War-style threats out of Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada. In 2019, Isaacman sold his majority stake to the investment firm Blackstone for a reported 9-figure sum, and personally kept flying anyway. That same year, he bought his own MiG-29UB, tail number N29UB, from the estate of Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen. By 2024, he was restoring 2 more MiG-29s, plus a British Tornado. FAA records reportedly show only 2 people in the entire United States privately own a MiG-29, Isaacman, and a company called Air USA doing a smaller version of the same thing. He is, right now, living the exact hypothetical this video just walked you through, start to finish. 1 jet, then a fleet, then a Pentagon contract, and eventually back to just 1 jet again in a private hangar. So how far could you actually take this with real money in real life? All the way up to, but never past, one specific line. Anything still on active duty, an F-16 flying real missions today, an F-35, an F-22, isn't for sale to you or to anyone at any price. It isn't about the size of your bank account at that point. It's classified avionics, stealth coatings, and software no government will let leave its own control. Those jets only enter this hypothetical decades from now, once they're formally retired, demilitarized, and cleared for export, exactly the way the MiG-29 and the L-39 were before them. Until then, the newest, most capable fighter jets on Earth stay exactly where their governments want them, permanently out of your reach, no matter how far you climb the ladder before it. Even after the purchase price, the training, and the fuel, there's a second layer of costs that never makes it into the spreadsheet. Someone has to actually maintain the thing. The median U.S. aircraft mechanic earns around $80,000 a year, and that's for someone qualified on ordinary aircraft. Find one who can actually work on a 50-year-old Soviet airframe with parts diagrams that were never written in English, and that number stops being ordinary. Then they're simply moving it. A tow tractor rated to push a jet this size can run anywhere from a few $1,000s used to well over $80,000 new. And eventually, it needs to look the part again. A basic repaint on a small aircraft starts around $11,000 to $15,000 before any corrosion treatment or the kind of historically accurate scheme collectors actually pay for. A full ground-up restoration, paint included, commonly lands somewhere between $500,000 and $3 million, depending on how far gone the airframe was to begin with. None of it shows up on the listing price. All of it shows up on the credit card statement, one invoice at a time, for as long as you own it. Zoom out for a second, because a number like this only means something next to other numbers. Take a 100-foot superyacht, the kind of boat that shows up in the same fantasy category as a fighter jet. Brokers put its annual running cost at $1 to $3 million a year, roughly 10 to 15% of the purchase price every single year. A light private business jet isn't much gentler. A Citation CJ3, flown a normal amount with a crew and a hangar, costs its owner right around $1 million a year, all in. Step up to a faster mid-sized jet, a Citation X, and that climbs past $2 million a year, more than double, mostly in crew salaries alone. Now put the entry tier of this very hobby next to those numbers. A modestly flown L-39 or MiG-21, fuel, insurance, hangar and all, can land somewhere around $100,000 to $200,000 a year. Which means, on paper, owning a fighter jet at the entry level can actually cost less every year than owning a business jet or a yacht built for the exact same kind of showing off. It's still an enormous amount of money by any normal measure. It's just not the most expensive toy on this particular list. There's one more practical question most people never think to ask. Where do you even keep something this loud? Loud isn't just an inconvenience, it's a legal one. Jet noise is regulated, and residents notice. Airports like Camarillo, California field enough noise complaints from nearby jet traffic that the county has run formal studies on flight paths overhead, decades after the airport was already there. That's civilian jet traffic. The military's own newest fighter, the F-35, measures louder on landing than either of the jets it replaced. Loud enough that one Florida city sued the Air Force over basing it nearby. So warbird owners tend to cluster at a small number of general aviation fields built around exactly this kind of flying. Chino, California is the best example. 2 museums there alone house nearly 300 vintage military aircraft between them. It isn't an accident. It's the same logic as everything else in this hobby. Find where the rules and the neighbors already tolerate what you're about to fly, and base it there. Owning it and being cleared to fly it isn't the last piece of paperwork. There's one more document that decides what you're actually allowed to do with the thing once it's yours. Almost every one of these jets flies under an FAA category called experimental, exhibition, because most of them were never designed, tested, or certified as a civilian aircraft in the first place. That certificate comes with its own separate paperwork, operating limitations, renewed every year, that spell out exactly what you're allowed to do in the air. Training, maintenance flights, proficiency, air shows, and exhibitions you've listed in advance. That's the list. That's the whole list. One thing is explicitly, federally off limits: charging someone money to ride in it. No compensation, no hire, full stop. A company called Warbird Adventures found that out the hard way, selling the public paid rides in their aircraft, advertised right on their own website. The FAA issued an emergency cease and desist order. The company appealed. In 2021, a federal appeals court sided with the FAA and upheld it. It wasn't a technicality, it was the whole business model, shut down by the same rule every other owner in this hobby is quietly operating under. So the jet in your hangar can take you flying. It can headline an air show. What it can never legally do is take a stranger's money and fly them instead. Air shows carry their own real risk, and the industry has had to learn that the hard way. In November 2022, a World War II bomber and a fighter collided in midair at a commemorative Air Force air show in Dallas, killing all 6 people aboard both aircraft. The NTSB's investigation didn't point at the pilots first. It pointed at the planning. No formal separation plan between aircraft was required by regulation that day, and none had been briefed. That finding pushed the airshow industry toward tighter aircraft separation rules industry-wide, a real and still unfolding response to a disaster that happened in the exact kind of flying this hobby revolves around. There's a second exit nobody mentioned back when we talked about selling, and it's the one serious collectors actually prefer. Instead of chasing a buyer in a market of maybe a few dozen people worldwide, you can donate the aircraft to a museum instead. Do that, and IRS rules treat it like donating a car or a boat. Normally your deduction is capped at whatever the museum resells it for, not what it's actually worth. But there's an exception. If the museum keeps flying it or displaying it, actually using it for its mission instead of just reselling it, that cap disappears, and you can deduct its full appraised value instead. That appraisal isn't optional either. Above $20,000, it has to come from an independent, IRS-qualified appraiser, filed with your tax return the same year. It's why a handful of serious collectors end up founding museums around their own collections instead of ever selling a single airframe. Ron Fagan did exactly that with his own Warbird collection. So did Mike George, decades earlier, with the Air Combat Museum. Keep it, display it, and let the tax code pay you back for never letting it go. From a welded shut missile rail to a $280 million Pentagon contract, that's what actually owning a fighter jet would take. It was never one price tag. It's a ladder. A $70,000 MiG-21 in rough shape, a $500,000 trainer, a $4 million interceptor, and at the very top, an entire private air force, if you were ever willing to climb that far. And a fighter jet is only the beginning. The same 3-part climb, buy it retired, gut it, learn to fly it, applies to attack helicopters, Cold War bombers, and machines far stranger than anything in this video. We'll be climbing that ladder one machine at a time. Subscribe for more on what it would actually take to own the things most people only ever dream about. New video every week.